The Gospel of John, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. And before I read the text once again, it's so good to see you here. Such a sweet spirit in the room on this Mother's Day, and such beautiful harmony. And Brian, thank you. What a beautiful prayer set to music. Lord, I want to know you more. In fact, part of the sweetness was, I think, I heard the youngest member in the room, little Georgiana, singing along with him. And she's either going to be a singer or a preacher at some point. But we did get to meet Robert and Laura's newest grandchild, and we're so delighted to welcome her to the service on this Mother's Day. A couple of other things really quickly, as Carol has shared and Rick has shared. Let me thank you for the tremendous hospitality you demonstrated on Thursday. It's been several weeks of hard work, but my inbox of emails and text and phone calls and notes from all around the state have been absolutely full of those commending the extraordinary hospitality they experienced on Thursday. And then finally, this morning, even as we worship, we're remembering our two interns, Ashley and Jamila, who are in their graduation at Mercer at McAfee this morning. And we are absolutely excited for them. We have a few of our folks who've joined them there, and we're praying this a grand celebration of their accomplishments as well. We're in the Gospel of John. We're in a series about following in the footsteps of Jesus. And beginning in verse 1 of chapter 16, we find these words in the New International Version. All this I've told you so that you will not fall away. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they're offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you this so that when their time comes, you will remember that I warned you about them. As many of our students are reviewing for their final exams, today, ironically, we come to a passage where Jesus is reviewing what he's previously taught his disciples in the preceding 6 chapters. Jesus has shared wise insights with his followers to keep them from falling away and to reduce their risk of stumbling. I love what Philip Yancey says about the Gospels, that the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament reflect the life of Jesus, what it means for us, and what it means for the world. In John's Gospel, Jesus gives us practical guidance for daily living in chapters 10 and following. In John 15:11, Jesus actually has previously said, I have told you these things so that you may be full of joy and that your joy may be complete. In John 16, Jesus restates his purpose for sharing these principles. In the message is worded like this: I've told you these things to prepare you for rough times ahead. The best wording of all, I think, is from the Amplified version of the New Testament, where Jesus' words are translated, I have told you these things so that you will not stumble or be caught off guard and fall away. It's interesting. It's almost like Jesus is quoting Psalm 53, verse 16, which says, For God, you have delivered me from death, and you have kept my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God, who is the light of my life. There are two things here that Jesus says to his disciples. In 15, he says, I've given you these teachings so that your joy may be complete. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, he says, I'm telling you these things. Listen carefully. Don't forget them. Mark them down. Write them in permanent ink so that you will not stumble or fall to the wayside. What has Jesus told them that's so important for them to remember? On this Mother's Day, I would like to have that same review with us that Jesus had with his disciples. I think there are at least 5 things Jesus was referring to when he said, I've given you this bit of information because it can be life-changing for you. I've shared these things because you're going to be tempted to go out into the far country and live there and waste your life. But don't do it. Remember what I've told you. I don't want you to stumble. I don't want you to fall away. I don't want you to decline in your faith. I want you to be enriched in your faith. Well, first, in chapter 10, Jesus invites us to a full and meaningful life. Never forget that the purpose of Jesus coming to earth isn't just to take us to heaven when we die, but to give us a full and meaningful life in the here and now. Now, make no mistake about it, Jesus doesn't give us a perfect life where all the circumstances are always favorable to us, but he does help us navigate the difficulties of life. In John 1:3, John says, in him, that is Jesus, the living word, in him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. John 3:16, God loved the world so much, and each and every one in it. Not just a certain city, not just a certain state, not just a certain country. God loved the whole world, that whoever will trust in him will not perish, will not waste away, will not be canceled, but will have everlasting, unending life. But then in John 10, Jesus says there's a thief, there's an adversary, there's an enemy, a spiritual adversary who comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. But Jesus said, I've come into the world so that you would have life, and life more abundant, and life that is free. Jesus came to give a full and meaningful life to all who will follow him. I think the second thing Jesus would underscore to his disciples, I've told you these things. Jesus gave us and them a new commandment, that we love one another. Now, Carol read a passage from the Old Testament that Jesus quoted. Her passage came from Deuteronomy. It was the Shema that gives us that beautiful passage about loving God with all our heart, loving our neighbor, and later Jesus even adds, love your enemy. But then there's also the Decalogue that we commonly call the 10 Commandments. Every one of the disciples who had ever been in a Jewish temple, every one of the disciples who had attended synagogue school would have known those 10 Commandments. Maybe like me, you had to memorize them when you were a child in Sunday school. Jesus wasn't erasing those 10, but he's saying, now I'm giving you a new commandment. You want to better interpret those 10? You want to better live out what you learn about God from those 10? He gave them a new commandment. In John 13, 34 through 35, Jesus says, I give you a new command, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another. Let me park there for a moment, because oftentimes we think others will know that we're disciples because we believe just like they do. Others will know that we're God's disciples because we are so diligent about sharing our faith. But Jesus said the way they're really going to know you're disciples is because of your love. And by the way, Thursday, you demonstrated tremendous hospitality, and you did so with the spirit of love. One of the primary reasons that people under the age of 35 do not participate in a fellowship of church, because they sense a lot more legalism and a lot less love there. A healthy church that wants to reach into the community excels in love. But they must be careful not only to love God, they must be careful to love one another, to be patient with one another, to be kind with one another. Some of the most kind people I know are people that I've met in the churches I've served. But I got to tell you, some of the meanest, most manipulative people I've ever met are in the churches I've served. And they were always in the minority, but they had a loud voice. And it's imperative for the spirit of love to prevail over the spirit of criticism, over the spirit of discontent, over the spirit of power mongering. Jesus gave us a new commandment to love one another. Jesus did not say love one another if you agree with one another. Love one another if you like one another. Love one another if you approve of one another. Love one another if it's an advantage for you to love one another. He just said, love one another without prerequisite, without condition. Jesus invites us to a full and meaningful life. Jesus gives us a command to love one another, both inside and outside the walls of the church. And third, Jesus came to give us peace. How many times does Jesus say over and again, do not let your heart be troubled. Do not be afraid. And yet there's so much fear in the world. This week, even as we were getting ready for the big event Thursday night, I had one session after another with people in the community and even members of the congregation who were just overwhelmed with worry and anxiety and fear. Sometimes it's vocational, sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes it's emotional. But they're overwhelmed with fear. Maybe that's the reason Jesus, in every single one of the Gospels, seems to talk constantly and consistently about peace. In John 14, verses 26 and 27, right before Jesus said, I've given you these teachings so that your joy may be complete, he reminds the disciples and all who follow him, but the advocate who is the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I've said to you. My peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give you peace as the world gives. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. I want to read that verse over and over because I need to hear it as much as anyone in this room. My peace I give to you. And the peace I give to you is not like the peace the world gives. So do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. Let me park there for just a moment because going back to John 10:10 when Jesus says, I came to give you a full and meaningful life, and he prefaces that by saying there's a thief, there's an adversary that comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. He may have meant the adversary is coming literally to try to take your life, but I suspect, based on what he said prior and afterward, that he's talking primarily about this adversary coming and stealing the peace and the joy that he came to give. There is a very unique potential inside each and every one of us that cannot be unearthed without taking a few risks and making a few mistakes and growing deeper in our faith. Do not fear failure, fear apathy, and fear indifference. All of us can learn from our mistakes. I want to go back to a couple of other Bible stories and a little bit of personal experience for just a moment, because I think when Jesus said the thief comes to steal, he came to steal your peace. Where does he steal our peace? Now bear with me so you hear this carefully. One of the things we learned from the book of Job earlier this spring is that when the adversary attacked Job, the adversary could not physically attack Job, but the adversary planted thoughts in Job's head. Where does this war and where does this coup to rob our peace take place? It takes place between the ears. I was with Reggie McNeil, our friend who gave us that wonderful book, The Missional Renaissance. And Reggie used a statement that I repeat to myself regularly during my devotional time. It may be helpful to you. He said, the enemy of your soul whispers chaos, despair, and anxiety in your ear. But the Spirit whispers peace. In my world, the enemy of my soul screams chaos, worry, and despair. I think the reason the Bible tells us to be attentive to the still small voice of God is because when the adversary is screaming, the Spirit of God is whispering peace. And you and I have a decision to make. We have to decide, are we going to listen to that voice of fear and chaos? Or are we going to listen to the Spirit who whispers peace? In our time of bewilderment, the Spirit whispers peace. In our time of confusion, the Spirit whispers peace. In our highest moment of anxiety, the Spirit whispers peace. In our moments of deepest grief, the Spirit whispers peace. What I can tell you from my own experience is when I listen to the voice of the adversary, my soul stays knotted in anxiety. And it's like tangled fishing line. I can't unravel it. But when I dare to dismiss that loud voice and listen to the Spirit who speaks comfort and encouragement and peace, it changes my disposition. It changes the way I study. It changes the way I preach. It changes the way I interact with friends and family. And so when Jesus tells his disciples, I came to give you peace, but not peace as the world gives, he's saying, I know what's going to happen. When I'm gone, you're going to be knotted in anxiety, and you're going to need to remember, I have sent the Spirit to give you peace. Then Jesus goes on to say, I'm the true vine, the source of a fruitful and productive life. Paul later, by the way, to relieve any pressure from us, Paul later reaffirms that salvation is by grace through faith, not of works, so that no one can boast. In other words, our performance and the way we live out our faith doesn't determine our salvation. But because we are secure in our salvation and that it comes to us by grace, we are free to live life to the maximum and to embrace that full and meaningful life that Jesus came to give. Jesus does not want his disciples or his followers or any one of us in this room to live a dormant or wasted life. By the way, one of my favorite writers, John Ortberg says the enemy of your soul will keep you so busy that you don't have time to remember what Jesus taught. He will so fill up your calendar that you mistake your busyness for spirituality. Jesus says the goal of your life is to bear fruit, to be productive. He wants us to live with a sense of ultimate significance. He said, I'm the true vine. My Father's the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. And while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. That's God's goal for us individually. That's God's goal for our congregation. Not to make us bigger, but to make us more fruitful. And as we grow in our faith and become more fruitful, the size of our family will take care of itself. Jesus goes on to talk about that there's such an untapped potential in you. And a part of that potential is there are seeds of faith and fruitfulness in you that have not yet germinated. And finally, moving quickly to the end, Jesus reminds his disciples that he sent his Spirit to be our teacher and to be our companion for the journey. First of all, this reminds us we are never alone in this world. Once again this week, another national article came out about the problem of loneliness. Loneliness exists among people who have no faith at all and among people who have a staunch faith. And we have to remind ourselves that we're not alone because the Spirit of God is with us and we are never alone. In John 15, verse 25, 26, 27, when the advocate comes who I'll send to you, he'll be the Spirit of truth that comes from the Father. He will testify about me. He will testify within you. For you have been with me and I have been with you from the beginning. That word with is a powerful word. In all the circumstances of life, God is with us. We are never alone. The Spirit is our advocate, our encourager. He's looking out for us. The Spirit is our teacher, constantly opening our eyes to what is true and to what is faithful. That word advocate is a tremendous word. There are two words that are used in Scripture for spiritual powers. One is accuser, and one is advocate. Back to Job for just a minute. What is the spirit of evil called in the book of Job? The accuser. What is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus, called in the New Testament? The advocate. When someone functions as an accuser, they've become an embodiment taking on the personality of the evil one. Are there accusers in our culture? You bet you. And they're imitating the adversary. Are there accusers in congregations? You bet your life on it. And they are more like the adversary than they are the Spirit. An advocate is a guardian, a protector, an encourager, one who keeps the peace, one who builds bridges, one who forges teamwork. Jesus sent His Spirit not only to be our advocate, but to tell us how to advocate for each other. I'm not sure if you read Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. I think there's some wonderful teaching there. I don't agree with all of it, but I think the most powerful statement in the entire book is what Rick's been preaching for years. The world knows what we're against. It's high time they know what we're for. What are we advocating for? What are we living for? What is Jesus wanting to do in our life and the life of our congregation? You see, to be a Christian is to be a follower of Jesus. To follow Jesus is to apply His teachings to life and to follow the direction of His Spirit. The great British scholar whom many of us have learned to love, N.T. Wright, says, if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it means to be human, look at Jesus. If you want to know what love looks like, look at Jesus. If you want to know what grief is, look at Jesus. And go on looking until you're not a spectator, but you're actually a part of the drama, which has Jesus as the central character. Let me tell you a quick story, and then we're going to sing. I love the stories from my Jewish friends about the rabbi. A rabbi and a soap maker went for a walk together. The soap maker, being very agnostic and cynical, said to the rabbi, exactly what good is religious faith? Look at all the trouble and misery of the world, still after years, thousands of years of teaching about goodness and truth and peace. After all the prayers, after all the sermons, after all the teaching. If religion is good and true, how could this be? And as rabbis tend to do, he was silent and said nothing, and they walked on and kept walking until they passed a small child who was playing in a ditch. And the rabbi turned to the soap maker and said, look at that child. You may think that soap makes people clean, but see the dirt on that youngster? So what good is soap? With all the soap in the world, over all the years, that child is still filthy. I wonder how effective soap is after all. And the soap maker wasn't silent at all. He protested, but Rabbi, soap can't do any good unless it's used. And the rabbi said, my point exactly. Neither can your faith. Maybe here's the word from the gospel. Don't be a spectator. Make Jesus the central character of your life story. Follow His guidance and learn from His teaching. And begin right now. And if you find yourself at the beginning of that journey of following Jesus, we want to encourage you on the road. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Ministers will be at the front and the back, the Peachtree room following the service. We'd love to talk with you about your church membership, about your profession of faith, about your baptism. One of the things the people of God do best is sing. We sing our prayers, we sing our praise, we sing our commitments. Let's stand and sing these words of commitment as Rick comes to lead us in singing.